There's a particular kind of silence that falls when you're in a conversation with someone whose politics you can't stand, and you realize in the middle of their argument that they're not entirely wrong. You don't say anything. You let the moment pass. You go back to your corner. But the silence stays with you, because you don't have a name for what just happened. And without a name, you can't do anything with it. That's what this video is about. Not which side is right. Not how to win the argument, but why the argument feels the way it does. Like two people standing in the same burning building, each insisting the other one started the fire, neither one with a map to the exit. There is a framework that explains this. It's more than a century old. It was written by a man who was in the middle of the loudest, most confident intellectual debates of his era, Shaw, Wells, Kipling, Bertrand Russell, and who managed to engage every single one of them without becoming contemptuous of any of them. That is not a small thing. And what made it possible was a single idea about the nature of error that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. The idea is this: the most dangerous ideas are not the ones that are wrong. They're the ones that are almost right. By the end of this video, you'll have a framework drawn from a book written in 1905 that explains why every modern ideology is simultaneously true and dangerous, and why the Christian tradition is the only architecture large enough to hold the truth inside each of them without being destroyed by any of them. Stay with me, because the first step is going to feel wrong. And that's the point. The word heresy has a problem. In 2026, it's become a word for winning arguments. You call someone a heretic, you mean you're outside the circle, you're suspect, you're one of them. It's a tribal signal, not a diagnosis. And because it's used that way, as a weapon, the actual meaning of the word has been buried. Chesterton noticed this happening in 1905, which tells you something about how long this has been going on. In the opening pages of Heretics, he makes an observation that should stop you cold. He says that calling someone a heretic used to be the most serious charge you could make against them. It meant you have taken something true and broken it away from the body of truth that gave it proportion. You've taken a real thing and made it the only thing. And by doing that, you've turned it into a lie. Not because it's false, but because it's amputated. Then, he says, something shifted. At some point, heretics stopped meaning someone who held a dangerous partial truth and started meaning someone who was daring, original, ahead of their time. Being called a heretic became a compliment. And the moment that happened, we lost the ability to identify our own condition. Think about what that means. The most useful diagnostic tool for understanding intellectual error. The idea that error is almost always a real truth severed from everything that would give it proportion was turned into a badge of honor. And so the very people most in need of the diagnosis became the least likely to recognize it. This is not an abstract point. Chesterton wasn't writing a word history essay. He was writing about Shaw and Wells and Kipling, the most respected minds of his generation. And he was saying, I admire these men. I enjoy their company. And they are, every one of them, heretics. Not because they're stupid, not because they're evil, because each of them has grabbed one real thing about the world and built an entire system from it with no door out. In Orthodoxy, written 3 years later, Chesterton makes the same point with a different image. He says the madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. He has a perfectly logical system. Every inference follows from the last. The circle is unbroken. The problem is that the circle is very small. There is one idea at the center, and no exit, and anyone who points to what's outside the circle is, by definition, not thinking clearly. That's the structural definition of an ideology. Not a lie. Not even an error. A perfectly coherent system built around one real insight, with all the exits sealed. Now let's watch the mechanism work, because this is where it stops being a clever observation about Victorian intellectuals and starts being the most useful tool you have for understanding 2026. Take Marxism, and before you dismiss it, I'm not asking you to sympathize with it. I'm asking you to find the real thing inside it, because it's there. Marx began with a genuine observation. Industrial capitalism in the 19th century was doing genuine violence to human beings. Workers were being consumed by a system that treated their labor as a commodity and their lives as irrelevant. That observation was not wrong. You could document it. You could see it. You didn't need a theory to know that children working 14 hours a day in a mill were being wronged. The real thing Marx saw was the dignity of labor. The reality that the person who makes something is not simply a tool for the benefit of someone else. That is a real truth. Augustine would have recognized it. Aquinas would have recognized it. The encyclicals of Leo XIII, written in the same era, recognized it. But then Marx amputated everything else. The individual, the particular irreducible human person with a soul and a story, disappeared into the class. History became a single mechanism with a single engine. Every institution, every tradition, every relationship was reduced to a question of who owned the means of production. The one real thing, the dignity of labor, swallowed everything else, including itself. Because you cannot protect the dignity of individual workers by dissolving the individual. That is the mechanism. A real grievance, a real truth. And then the amputation. Take nationalism, not the ordinary love of your country and your particular people, which is a sane and human thing, but nationalism as an ideology. The real thing at the center is genuine. Cultural particularity matters. The language your grandmother spoke matters. The stories your people tell about who they are and where they came from matter. There is something real being defended, but then the amputation. The stranger becomes a threat by definition. The outsider is not a person with a particular history of their own, but a contamination. The real thing, love of the particular, gets cut off from the obligation that gives it proportion, the recognition that the stranger is also a particular person, with a grandmother who spoke a language, with stories of their own. The real thing is amputated. And the result, in every case where nationalism has become an ideology rather than an ordinary affection, has been catastrophic. 2 cases. Same structure, real truth, amputation, closed system. Now I have to do something harder. Because the same lens applies to the ideology closest to the air most of us are breathing right now. Call it therapeutic individualism. Or expressive individualism. It goes by different names. But the core claim is something like this. The inner life of the person, their authentic self, their genuine feelings, their particular experience of who they are, is the highest court of appeal. The self is the measure. External obligations, inherited identities, traditional structures, these are legitimate only insofar as the self consents to them. And here's the thing. There is a real truth inside that. There is a self. The inner life does matter. The particular person in front of you, their experience, their suffering, their genuine feelings, has a dignity that no institution has the right to simply overwrite. That is not nothing. It's something the Christian tradition itself affirms. But you can feel the amputation coming. When the self becomes the final court of appeal, with no external reference that the self didn't authorize, something quietly collapses. Because selves are not self-interpreting. A person in the grip of grief or addiction or pride or simple confusion who has access to no authority outside their own experience is not free. They are trapped in a circle as tight as the madman's, with no map that didn't originate from inside the circle. The real truth, the dignity of the inner life, gets cut off from the obligation that gives it proportion. The recognition that the self is shaped, limited, held in check, and ultimately fulfilled by things it didn't invent. Same structure. Real truth. Amputation. I'm not saying these ideologies are equivalent. I'm not saying the problems they identified weren't real. I'm saying they share a shape. And until you can see the shape, you can't actually engage with any of them. You can only react. If you're finding the shape of this useful, why ideologies start with something real and then become prisons, there's a next step. The link in the description has the 8 strongest arguments from the classical Christian tradition, in plain language, with the most common objection and a 1-sentence response to each. Not a course, not a series, a 2-sided cheat sheet designed to fit in a wallet. Because the conversation you need to have doesn't happen after a seminar. It happens at the dinner table, and it happens fast. That's what the best arguments is for. It's in the description. There's a character in Dostoevsky that I want you to meet. Because Dostoevsky does something Chesterton does analytically. He does it from the inside. He shows you what it feels like to be the ideology rather than just observing it from outside. The Underground Man, the narrator of Notes from Underground, written in 1864, begins with a genuine grievance. He has been humiliated. He has been ignored. The society around him has treated him as a nothing, and he has been treated badly. There is something real at the start, but he takes that real thing, the authentic pain of a man who has been dismissed, and builds an entire philosophy from it. Not a philosophy of justice or repair, a philosophy of spite. His most coherent project becomes self-destruction, because destroying himself is the only act of genuine freedom still available to him. He is utterly logical. The circle is closed. Every inference follows. And the result is a man who has made his injury into a prison that he guards against anyone who might try to let him out. This is not a metaphor. This is the mechanism running at human scale in a specific person, with all the ugliness and pathos that ideologies tend to clean up when they write their manifestos. The underground man's grievance was real. What he made of it was a closed system with no exit. And Dostoevsky, who understood this from the inside, who had his own underground years, shows you the cost of it with a clarity that no political analysis quite matches. The cost is the self. The ideology consumes the thing it set out to protect. That is the heresy at its most vivid, not a lie. A truth turned into a cell. So here is where everything changes. If you followed the argument this far, you might be expecting a conclusion that goes something like this. And therefore, the ideologies are wrong and the tradition is right, and you can go home feeling confirmed. That is not the conclusion. The conclusion is harder and, I think, more interesting than that. Chesterton's argument in the final pages of Heretics is not that the partial truths are lies. It's that the age keeps generating partial truths with nowhere to put them, no architecture large enough to hold them in proportion to each other. The problem is not that Marx saw something real in the dignity of labor. The problem is that he had no frame large enough to hold that truth alongside the truth of the individual person, alongside the truth of tradition and inherited culture, alongside the truth of transcendence. He had the real thing, and no architecture for it. The same is true of every ideology this video has named. They are all, in Chesterton's precise sense, heresies. Not lies. Mutilations. Truths that lost their proportions because they lost their context. And here is the inversion. The Christian tradition is not the answer against these ideologies. It is the answer for the truths they are trying to protect. Read that again, because it's easy to slide past. The tradition holds the dignity of labor, and it holds it alongside the irreducible human person, which is why it cannot dissolve the worker into the class. The tradition holds the love of cultural particularity, and it holds it alongside the obligation to the stranger, which is why it cannot turn affection into contempt. The tradition holds the dignity of the inner life, and it holds it alongside the reality that the self is not self-sufficient, not self-interpreting, not the final chord of its own appeal. The tradition is the only architecture large enough to hold all of these at once without being destroyed by any of them. Not because it is more clever than the ideologies, because it is older than the partial truths have been partial. Old enough to remember what each truth looked like before the amputation. This is what Chesterton meant when he kept saying that the new heresies were old Christian virtues gone mad. Not invented sins, not exotic errors. Virtues, real ones with genuine moral weight, that had been isolated from each other and from the rest. Courage without prudence becomes recklessness. Justice without mercy becomes cruelty. Compassion without truth becomes a form of contempt. These are not made-up problems. They are the predictable result of taking a real virtue and cutting it off from everything that would give it proportion. The ideologies did not invent new problems. They inherited real truths and amputated them. And the tradition, if it's understood and not merely performed, is the surgery that reconnects what was severed. Which brings you back to the silence at the dinner table. The silence that falls when someone whose politics you can't stand says something you can't entirely dismiss. You didn't know what to do with that because you didn't have the right frame. Here's a frame. They probably got the real thing right. Find it. Name it to yourself and eventually to them. You're not conceding the argument. You're finding the truth that's real inside the position you oppose. And then, once you've found it, you can ask kindly, without contempt, what's been amputated to get there? What's been cut off from it that would give it proportion? What the tradition holds that the ideology forgot. You won't win the argument this way, but you'll have the conversation that might actually matter. The heretic doesn't need to be defeated. Chesterton knew this, which is why he genuinely liked Shaw and Wells, even while taking their ideas apart. The heretic needs to be completed, shown what's on the other side of the wall, given the rest of the architecture. That is what you're holding now. Here is the question I'll leave you with. Not a rhetorical one. Which partial truth are you protecting so hard that you've amputated everything that would give it proportion? Not theirs, yours. If you can name it, if you can sit with it long enough to find the amputation, you'll know something about yourself that most people never find out. And you'll be better equipped to hold the rest of the tradition's architecture, not just the part of it that has always felt natural to you. Tell me which modern ideology you find hardest to dismiss and why.